Henry Morrison Flagler was a pretty cool dude, believe it or not. Most of you must be thinking, I don't know who the heck this guy is and what the heck he even did. There's no way he can be influential. Well, we're here to prove you wrong. Our journey begins in New York, where our man Henry was born in 1835 to Isaac Flagler and Elizabeth Caldwell Morrison Harkness. That's a mouthful. See, Elizabeth's ex-husband croaked after she had her first son Daniel. Then Isaac, Henry's father, had another son before marrying Elizabeth, but he's more or less irrelevant. Daniel, Henry's half-brother, is the important guy here. Henry goes to school until age 14, and then Daniel comes in asking, "Hey dude, I'm working for my uncle in some store he owns. Want to join and make some cash?" Henry, probably going through the 1840s equivalent of a rebellious emo phase, says, "Sure, man, I guess," and tells his parents. They don't really understand him, but he moves on and starts working anyways. Because who needs a higher education when you can work at your stepbrother's uncle's store in the great state of Ohio? Henry makes a whopping $5 a month, which wasn't all that bad considering what some guys were being paid. Yikes. But what's cool is eventually Daniel takes over the company and reforms it a bit. Pretty soon, Daniel promotes Henry to his official business partner, making bank at $40 per month. Meanwhile, Henry finds himself a marriage partner, Mary Harkness, who happens to be Dan's cousin. That's a little awkward. Anyway, they'll go on to have 3 kids, 2 of which will croak before they have kids. The other one is the ultimate son of the year because he makes a whole museum about his dad. Eventually, this man's got so much experience, he straight founds a salt mining company with his brother-in-law, Barney. Everything's going well until the Civil War, when the demand for salt pretty much dies. So the company collapses, and Henry hauls himself back to the great state of Ohio and loses a lot of money from his investments. $100,000 to be exact, but the dude isn't a quitter. He picks himself up and enters into the grain business, eventually paying back his very excessive debt from that little salt business crash. Here, he runs into this other industrialist dude named Rockefeller, and the two get to discussing money and life and more money, maybe even mustaches. Rockefeller comes up with this whole idea about getting the heck out of the grain business and heading to Cleveland, which has a lot of oil. Having done business with our man Henry here for some time, Rockefeller's like, "Hey dude, let's go find some oil." Oil seems significantly more valuable than grain, so Henry's like all in. Henry approaches one of his relatives and he's like, "Hey, I need some money. If you give me money, you can have some shares in my new company." He says okay, and thus the Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler Company was born. This later becomes known as the Standard Oil Company. That should ring a bell. Who's Andrews, you might ask? Not very important at this time, that's what he is. But he does some pretty cool things, like building a mansion and getting bought out by Flagler later on down the road. Anyway, back to good old Standard Oil. Standard Oil is growing like crazy. In 2 years, they're the leader of the refining oil industry. Another 5 years pass and they decide to relocate to New York with the big guys. While in New York, Mary, Henry's wife, gets sick due to some health problems she already had. Her doctors tell the family to move to Florida for the winter, and they do that. Florida at the time kind of sucked. Mary doesn't recover and dies in 1881, leaving Henry as a single dad just trying to raise his young son in the not-so-big city. He gets over it in about 2 years and marries Ida Shrouds and moves to another part of Florida, St. Augustine to be exact. While there, he realizes, hey, Florida's nice. However, he also sees that the transportation systems in the hotel facilities really suck. "The transportation systems in the hotel facilities really suck," he said. "I'm gonna build some nice hotels and buy the railroads." He calls up Rockefeller, who's a little busy tickling women in New York, and says, "This has been fun, but I'm gonna go build some hotels in Florida." And so he builds his hotels. He builds a lot of hotels. He also builds some churches, both Protestant and Catholic, a hospital, some electric and sewer utilities, and a huge winter home for his family that he dubs the Kirkside. Next order of business in the Making Florida Not Suck agenda was the railroads. He buys a little piece of railroad between Jacksonville and St. Augustine and approaches the owners of the railway system. "Hey, railroad owners, I noticed that your systems kinda suck. Could you maybe make them not suck?" "No," says the railroad owners. After going back and forth for a while, Flagler says, "Okay then, I'll buy controlling stock, then make myself president, and appoint a general manager." And he does all that. What a guy. So Flagler continues building the Florida East Coast Railway until he reaches Biscayne Bay. There, Flagler constructs a bunch of channels, streets, water systems, power systems, the whole 9 yards. Citizens there are so grateful for the new city that they've got that they want to name the place after Flagler. But Flagler's like, "Nah, it's fine, let's just name it after these Native Americans that lived here 100 years or so ago." And thus, the city of Miami was born. A year later, Flagler builds the Hotel Royal Palm in the same city. Meanwhile, Flagler's second wife ends up in a mental institution in New York, and he remarries. To show his love for his third wife, he builds a huge winter home for her, with all the goods. Flagler suddenly wanted to extend his railroad system from Biscayne Bay to Key West in an overseas railroad. During its construction in the 1900s, a couple of hurricanes hit, which really sucks for a railroad being built mostly over water, but that didn't stop Flagler and his workers from completing the railroad anyway. The people living in Key West were pretty excited about it. In 1913, Flagler falls down a flight of stairs, breaks his hip, and dies a couple days later, but boy did this guy leave behind a legacy. His overseas railroad was kinda sorta destroyed in a Labor Day hurricane in 1935, but that didn't stop the project from being one of the most ambitious engineering projects ever conducted by a private citizen. He played a large part in Standard Oil, without the controversy that Rockefeller ended up with. He built hotels, water systems, churches, schools, and was a key player in the development of Florida altogether, especially since he's literally been dubbed the father of Miami. His development in Florida also contributed to some pretty cool author success stories. Without this guy, Florida wouldn't be nearly as prosperous as it is today. So that's pretty influential.